Hi friends, welcome to a new brand's video. Tonight we have 1 hour horror stories for you, but before we begin, as usual, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe only if you enjoy tonight's stories. Only a few ads in the first 10 minutes and after that all completely ads free. So without further ado, I don't want to waste your time, dim the light, chill, relax, and let's begin the stories.
3 years ago, I started working as a park ranger in Yellowstone National Park. It was everything I had ever wanted. The endless wilderness, the quiet mornings watching elk graze near the tree line, the satisfaction of helping visitors navigate trails they would remember for the rest of their lives. I was proud of that job. Proud enough that when my supervisor asked me to cover a remote backcountry station for 2 weeks, while another ranger recovered from surgery, I agreed without hesitation. The station was located deep in a section of the park that most tourists never see. It was a small wooden cabin with a radio, a wood stove, and a single cot pushed against the wall. After reviewing the logbooks and familiarizing myself with the patrol routes, I settled in and began my assignment. Communication happened mostly through the radio and rarely in person like I was used to at the main station. But everything seemed manageable. I checked in twice a day with dispatch, logged wildlife, sightings, and maintained the trails in my sector. It felt like solitary but straightforward work. But reflecting on it now, that first week was the period of normalcy. Even before the strange events began, something about that place felt slightly wrong. I started noticing odd details at unexpected times. The first thing was the silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence you might imagine when you think of nature. This was a heavy silence, the kind that presses against your ears. At night, I would sit on the porch of the cabin and realize that I could not hear anything. No insects, no owls, no wind moving through the pines, just nothing. I told myself it was normal. Remote areas can be like that sometimes. Animals move through in waves, and maybe I had just arrived during a quiet period. I wrote it off and continued with my duties. On the fourth night, I was walking back to the cabin after checking a trail camera about 2 miles out. The sun had already dropped behind the mountains, and the forest was settling into that blue twilight that comes before full darkness. I had my flashlight, my radio, and my bear spray. I was not worried. But as I walked, I began to feel like I was being watched. It was not a dramatic feeling. Not like in the movies where the character suddenly freezes and the music swells. It was subtle. Just a slow awareness creeping into my mind that something in the trees was paying attention to me. I stopped walking and listened. Nothing. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight and saw only bark and shadow. I waited for maybe 30 seconds, then continued toward the cabin. That night, I could not sleep. I lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence outside. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps. Not the heavy steps of a bear or an elk. These were lighter, almost careful, like something walking slowly around the perimeter of the cabin. I reached for my flashlight and sat up. The footsteps stopped. I waited. After a few minutes of nothing, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Maybe a branch settling or a small animal passing through. I eventually fell asleep, but it was restless. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check for tracks. The ground near the back wall was soft from recent rain, and I found what I was looking for. There were footprints in the mud. They were human. Bare feet. Someone had been walking around my cabin in the middle of the night without shoes. I stood there for a long time staring at those prints. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe another ranger had come by and I had not heard them properly. Maybe a lost hiker had stumbled onto the station and then wandered off before I woke up. But neither explanation made sense. The nearest trailhead was over 15 miles away, and no other rangers were assigned to this sector. I radioed dispatch and reported what I found. They sounded confused, but told me they would make a note of it. They asked if I wanted someone to come check on me, but I said no. I felt embarrassed, like I was overreacting. I told them I would keep an eye out and check in again that evening. That was my first mistake. The second week is when things got worse. And I mean genuinely worse, not just unsettling. I started finding things that did not belong. Small objects left in places I had already walked through. A pile of stones arranged in a circle near the trail camera. A dead bird placed on the railing of my porch, positioned carefully, almost deliberately. None of it made sense. None of it felt like the work of an animal. I radioed dispatch again, and this time I was more insistent. I told them something was wrong out here, that someone was messing with me, and that I needed backup, or at least confirmation, that no one else was supposed to be in this sector. They checked their records and assured me that no other personnel had been assigned to my area. They offered to send someone out, but it would take at least 2 days because of weather conditions moving in from the north. 2 days felt like a lifetime. That night, I barricaded the door with the wooden chair and kept my flashlight within reach. I did not sleep. I just lay there, listening, and around 2 in the morning I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. But this time, they stopped at the window. I did not move. I did not breathe. I just stared at the thin curtain separating me from whatever was outside. The moonlight was faint, but I could see a shadow standing there. It was shaped like a person, tall and still. It just stood there, not moving, not making a sound. I do not know how long we stayed like that. It felt like hours. Eventually, the shadow moved away and the footsteps faded into the forest. I did not get up to check. I stayed on that cot until the sun came up, and even then, I did not feel safe. The next morning, I found more footprints. Same bare feet, same careful placement. But this time, they led right up to the window and then back into the trees. I followed them as far as I could, maybe a quarter mile into the forest. But they just stopped. No trail, no disturbance in the brush. They simply ended in the middle of nowhere, like whoever made them had vanished into thin air. I spent the rest of that day inside. I kept the curtains closed and the radio on, just to hear another human voice. Dispatcher checked in with me twice, and I told them I was fine. I was not fine. I was terrified. But I did not know how to explain what was happening without sounding crazy. That final night, I made a decision. I was not going to wait for backup. I was going to pack my gear and hike out at first light, weather or no weather. I had this deep feeling in my gut that if I stayed another night, something bad was going to happen. But before I could fall asleep, I heard something different. It was not footsteps this time. It was breathing. Heavy, slow breathing right outside the door. Like something was standing there, just waiting. I grabbed my flashlight and my bear spray, and I sat in the corner of the cabin, watching the door. The breathing continued for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped. I heard footsteps walking away, and then silence. I did not sleep at all that night. When the sun finally rose, I packed my bag in under 5 minutes, and I left. I did not look back. I just walked as fast as I could toward the main trail, and I did not stop until I reached the ranger station 6 hours later. When I told my supervisor what happened, he listened carefully. He did not laugh or dismiss me. He just nodded and said that I was not the first person to report strange activity in that sector. Apparently, 2 other rangers had requested transfers after spending time at that cabin. Neither of them wanted to talk about why. I never went back. I transferred to a different park the following year, and I have not set foot in Yellowstone since. Sometimes I still think about those footprints in the mud, and the shadow at my window, and the breathing outside my door. I do not know what was out there with me. I do not want to know. But I can tell you this much. There are places in the wilderness where humans are not supposed to go, and sometimes the wilderness lets you know. I have been a park ranger at Yellowstone for 11 years now. In that time, I have seen things that would make most people reconsider ever stepping foot in a national park again. Bear attacks, hypothermia victims, people who wandered off marked trails and were never seen again. The wilderness has a way of reminding you that humans are not at the top of the food chain out here. We are visitors, and sometimes the land decides we have overstayed our welcome. Missing persons cases are more common than the public realizes. Every year, dozens of people vanish in national parks across the country. Most of them are found eventually. Some walked too far and got disoriented. Others had medical emergencies in remote areas where help could not reach them in time. A few, tragically, made the choice to end their lives in what they considered a beautiful final resting place. These cases are sad, but they make sense. There is logic to them, even when the outcomes are devastating. But the case I am about to tell you does not make sense. It happened 3 years ago, and I still think about it almost every single day. I have never shared this publicly before, partly because I do not want to cause panic, and partly because I am not sure anyone would believe me. But lately I have been having trouble sleeping, and I feel like I need to get this off my chest. Maybe writing it down will help. Maybe it will just make things worse. I honestly do not know anymore. It started in early October. The crowds had thinned out considerably after Labor Day, and the park had that quiet, almost melancholy feeling it gets when autumn settles in. The aspens were turning gold, and the air had that crisp bite to it that tells you winter is not far behind. I was stationed at the Lamar Valley Outpost at the time, covering a massive stretch of backcountry that most tourists never see. A family had come in to report that their son was missing. His name was Daniel Whitmore, 23 years old, an experienced hiker who had been camping solo near Grouse Creek. He was supposed to meet his parents at the trailhead the previous morning, but he never showed up. They waited for 6 hours before driving to our station. I remember his mother's face. She was trying so hard to stay calm, but her hands were shaking as she handed me a photograph of Daniel. He looked like a typical outdoors guy, fit build, friendly smile, the kind of face you would trust immediately. His father kept saying that Daniel knew what he was doing, that he had hiked in worse conditions before, that something must have gone wrong. We assembled a search team that same afternoon. 6 rangers, 2 tracking dogs, and a helicopter on standby. The weather was clear, visibility was good, and we had a solid idea of where Daniel had been camping based on his permit. Everything about this search should have been straightforward. The hike to Grouse Creek takes about 4 hours if you are moving at a decent pace. The terrain is challenging, but not impossible. Dense pine forests, steep inclines, a few stream crossings that can be tricky after heavy rain. We reached Daniel's campsite just before sunset, and that is when things started to feel wrong. His tent was still standing. His gear was neatly organized inside, sleeping bag rolled up, cooking supplies stored in a bear canister exactly how you are supposed to do it. His backpack was leaning against a tree, and his hiking boots were placed right next to the tent flap. The fire pit had cold ashes, maybe 2 days old based on our estimate. Everything looked like Daniel had simply stepped away for a moment and planned to come right back. But there was no sign of Daniel anywhere. We called his name until our throats were raw. The dogs picked up his scent immediately, which was encouraging at first. They followed it about 300 yards north of the campsite, toward a rocky outcropping that overlooked a small ravine. And then they stopped. Both dogs at the exact same spot. They sat down, whined, and refused to go any further. I have worked with tracking dogs for years. I have seen them lose a scent before. It happens when someone crosses water, or when weather conditions deteriorate, or when too much time has passed. But I had never seen dogs react like this. They were not confused. They were scared. Their tails were tucked. Their ears were flat, and no amount of coaxing could get them to move forward. We searched the area on foot until it got too dark to continue safely. Found nothing. No footprints beyond that rocky spot, no disturbed vegetation, no clothing or personal items. It was like Daniel had walked to that exact point and then simply ceased to exist. That night, we set up a base camp about half a mile from his tent. I volunteered for the first watch, partly because I could not sleep anyway. The forest was unusually quiet. No owls, no rustling from small animals, nothing. Just silence and the occasional creak of branches in the wind. Around 2 a.m, I heard something that I still cannot fully explain. It sounded like a voice, distant and distorted, coming from somewhere deeper in the trees. At first, I thought it might be one of the other rangers talking in their sleep. But the voice was not coming from our camp. It was coming from the direction of Daniel's tent. I did not wake the others. I should have. But something about that sound made me feel like I was supposed to hear it alone, like it was meant for me specifically. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking. Looking back, I know how stupid that was. Every training manual, every protocol, every ounce of common sense I had accumulated over 11 years of this job was screaming at me to stay put, to wake the others, to not go wandering into the dark alone toward an unexplained sound. But you have to understand something about that moment. The voice did not sound threatening. It sounded familiar. It sounded like someone I knew, though I could not place who. And there was this pulling sensation in my chest, like a thread had been attached to my rib cage, and something was gently tugging me forward. I walked for maybe 10 minutes before I reached Daniel's campsite again. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the darkness, illuminating patches of pine needles and the occasional startled moth. The tent looked exactly as we had left it. Nothing had been disturbed. But the voice was closer now, and I could almost make out words. It sounded like someone crying. Not loud, hysterical sobbing, but the quiet, exhausted kind of crying that comes after you have been at it for hours and you do not have anything left. The kind that makes your chest ache just hearing it. I called out Daniel's name. The crying stopped immediately. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat pulsing in my ears. I stood there, flashlight raised, scanning the tree line, waiting for something to happen. And then I heard my own voice. I do not mean I heard something that sounded similar to my voice. I mean I heard myself, my exact voice, coming from somewhere in the trees about 50 feet to my left. It said my name, just once, clear as day. The same inflection, the same slight rasp I get when I have been talking too much. It was me, but it was not me. I was standing right there, and I had not said a word. The fear hit me all at once, like stepping into ice water. Every hair on my body stood up, and my legs went weak. I wanted to run, but I could not make myself move. I just stood there, pointing my flashlight toward where the voice had come from, my hand trembling so badly that the beam was dancing across the branches. Nothing was there. At least nothing I could see. I do not remember walking back to base camp. I must have, because I woke up the next morning in my sleeping bag with my boots still on and dirt on my hands. The other rangers said I had returned sometime around 3 and gone straight to sleep without saying anything. They asked if I was feeling all right, and I told them I was fine, just tired. I did not mention the voice. I did not mention any of it. How could I? They would have thought I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. We continued the search for 4 more days, brought in additional teams, expanded the perimeter, used thermal imaging from the helicopter. We found absolutely nothing. No body, no clothing, no evidence that Daniel Whitmore had ever walked beyond that rocky outcropping. The official report listed him as a missing person, case unsolved, likely a wilderness accident with the remains undiscovered due to animal activity or environmental factors. But I knew that was not true. Whatever happened to Daniel was not an accident. I had felt something out there in those woods, something that did not belong, something that knew my name and could wear my voice like a mask. I transferred to a different station 2 months later, told my supervisors I needed a change of scenery, and they did not ask too many questions. Rangers burn out all the time in this job. Nobody thought it was unusual. I tried to put Grouse Creek behind me, tried to convince myself that exhaustion and stress had made me imagine things. For a while, it almost worked. Then, about a year after the search, I received an email from Daniel's mother. She was reaching out to thank me for my efforts during the search. She said she had finally begun to accept that her son was gone, though she still held on to a small hope that someday there would be closure. At the end of the email, she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. She said that a few weeks after Daniel disappeared, she had received a voicemail from his phone. The call had come in at 3 in the morning, and when she played it back, all she could hear was static and what sounded like someone breathing. Then, just before the message ended, she heard Daniel's voice say a single word. Her name. Just once. Clear as day. His phone had been in his backpack at the campsite the entire time. We had recovered it during the search and confirmed it had been powered off for at least 48 hours before we arrived. There was no way he could have made that call. I did not respond to her email for 3 days. I did not know what to say. How do you tell a grieving mother that you believe something took her son, something that can mimic voices and make phone calls from devices that should not work? You do not. You cannot. So I wrote back a generic response about how sorry I was for her loss and how I hoped she would find peace eventually. It felt hollow, but it was all I could offer. After that, I started doing research, quietly, on my own time, using resources that most people do not know exist. I pulled records on every missing persons case in that region of Yellowstone, going back 30 years. I talked to retired rangers who had worked those areas before me. I read through old incident reports that had been filed away and forgotten. What I found did not make me feel better. It made everything worse. There was a pattern, not an obvious one, not something that would stand out to anyone who was not looking for it specifically. But once I saw it, I could not unsee it. Every few years, someone would go missing near Grouse Creek or the surrounding backcountry. Always solo hikers or campers. always people who were experienced enough that they should not have gotten lost. And in almost every case, there were reports of strange sounds in the days before the disappearance, voices that did not match anyone in the area, crying that seemed to come from nowhere. Sometimes witnesses described hearing their own names being called from the forest when no one else was around. The earliest case I could find dated back to 1987. A wildlife biologist named Patricia Vance had been conducting field research near Slough Creek when she vanished without a trace. Her colleague, who had been camping about a mile away, reported hearing someone calling his name repeatedly the night before Patricia disappeared. He assumed it was her, but when he went to check, no one was there. Her body was never found. I compiled everything into a file that I keep locked in a drawer at home. I have never shown it to anyone. I do not know if I ever will. Sometimes I take it out and read through the pages, trying to find some explanation that makes sense, some thread that ties everything together in a way that does not involve something impossible. I have not found one yet. The thing that scares me most is not knowing what I encountered that night. It is knowing that whatever it is still out there. The Grouse Creek area is still open to hikers and campers. People still get permits to spend the night in those backcountry zones. And every so often, I check the incident reports and see a new name added to the missing persons list. I think about reaching out to those families sometimes. I think about telling them what I know, or at least what I suspect. But what would be the point? It would not bring their loved ones back. It would only add confusion to their grief. So I stay quiet, and I watch, and I wait for the day when someone finally figures out what is happening in those woods. Last month, something happened that made me decide to finally write this all down. Last month, something happened that made me decide to finally write this all down. I was at home, a small cabin about 20 miles outside the park boundaries. It was a Tuesday night, nothing special about it. I had just finished dinner and was reading through some paperwork when my phone buzzed with a text message. The number was not in my contacts, but the area code was local, so I figured it was probably a colleague or someone from the ranger station. The message was just 3 words: still looking for me. I sat there staring at my phone for a long time. My first thought was that it was a wrong number, some kind of mistake or maybe a weird prank. But something about it felt intentional, felt directed at me specifically. I typed back, asking who this was, but the message failed to send. I tried calling the number, and it went straight to a disconnected tone. When I searched for the number online, nothing came up. I told myself it was nothing. Probably some kids messing around, spoofing numbers and sending creepy texts for laughs. That is the kind of thing that happens these days. People have too much time on their hands, and not enough sense. I deleted the message and tried to forget about it. But then I started noticing other things. Small things at first, easy to dismiss or explain away. I would come home and feel like something in the cabin had been moved slightly. Not ransacked or disturbed in any obvious way, just shifted. A book on a different shelf than where I remembered leaving it. A chair pushed back from the table when I always tucked them in. The window blinds angled differently than how I set them in the morning. I installed a security camera by my front door. Checked the footage every day for 2 weeks. Never saw anything unusual. No visitors, no animals, nothing. Just empty frames of my porch and the trees beyond. But the feeling of being watched did not go away. If anything, it got stronger. Then came the dreams. I am not someone who remembers dreams very often. Most nights, I close my eyes, and the next thing I know, the alarm is going off, and it is morning. But starting a few weeks ago, I began having the same dream over and over. I am back at the Grouse Creek campsite, standing in front of Daniel's tent. It is nighttime, and the forest is completely silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just me in the tent in the darkness, pressing in from all sides. In the dream, I know I'm supposed to open the tent. I do not want to. Every part of me is screaming to turn around and walk away. But my hand reaches out anyway, grabs the zipper, and starts pulling it down. The sound it makes is impossibly loud, like it is echoing off mountains that should not be there. And just before the flap opens, just before I can see what is inside, I wake up. Every single time, right at that moment. I wake up with my heart pounding and my sheets soaked through with sweat. And for a few seconds after opening my eyes, I swear I can still hear that zipper sound fading away like it followed me out of the dream. I went to see a doctor about a month ago. Told her I was having trouble sleeping, which was true. She prescribed some medication that was supposed to help me stay in deeper sleep cycles and avoid the kind of disruptions that cause nightmares. I took it for about a week. The dreams did not stop. If anything, they got more vivid, more real. I stopped taking the pills. 2 weeks ago, I drove out to the Grouse Creek area for the first time since the search. I do not know why I did it. Maybe I thought seeing the place again in daylight would help me make peace with what happened, would prove to my brain that there was nothing to be afraid of. It was stupid. I know that now. But I needed to do something. And that was the only thing I could think of. The campsite looked different than I remembered. Smaller somehow, and more overgrown. 3 years of weather and neglect had erased most of the signs that anyone had ever been there. No trace of Daniel's tent or gear, obviously. All of that had been collected as evidence and eventually returned to his family. Just a clearing in the pines where the undergrowth was a little thinner than the surrounding area. I stood there for maybe 20 minutes, not really doing anything. Just looking around, breathing the cold air, trying to feel whatever it was I thought I needed to feel. The forest was quiet, but it was a normal kind of quiet. Birds calling in the distance, a slight breeze moving through the branches. Nothing unusual, nothing wrong. I was about to head back to my truck when I noticed something at the edge of the clearing. A pile of stones, maybe a dozen of them, stacked on top of each other in a rough pyramid shape. It looked deliberate, like someone had placed them there on purpose. I did not remember seeing it during the search, but then again, I had not been paying attention to every rock on the ground. I walked over and crouched down to get a closer look. The stones were weathered, covered in lichen and moss. They had clearly been there for a while, maybe years. At the base of the pile, half buried in the dirt, I saw something that made my stomach drop. It was a ranger patch, the kind we wear on our uniforms, embroidered with the National Park Service logo. It was faded and dirty, but I could still make out the design clearly. And stitched along the bottom edge in small letters that I had to squint to read was a name, Vance. Patricia Vance, the wildlife biologist who had disappeared in 1987. I did not touch it. I did not take any photos. I just stood up and walked away, as fast as I could without running. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely grip the steering wheel when I got back to my truck. I drove straight home, locked all my doors, and sat in my living room till the sun came up. I have not been back to that area since. I do not think I ever will. Here is what I believe, though I have no way to prove it, and no one to tell who would take me seriously. Something lives in those woods near Grouse Creek. I do not know what it is or where it came from, or what it wants, but it has been there for a long time. maybe longer than the park itself. It takes people. Not randomly, but deliberately. It chooses them somehow for reasons I cannot understand. And once it has chosen someone, there is nothing that person can do to escape. I think it almost chose me that night during the search. I think that voice I heard, the one that sounded exactly like mine, was some kind of lure, an invitation. And if I had followed it any further into those trees, I would have ended up just like Daniel Whitmore and Patricia Vance and all the others whose names are sitting in that file in my drawer. I do not know why I was spared. Maybe I turned back before it was too late. Maybe it simply was not my time yet. Or maybe, and this is the thought that keeps me awake most nights, it is still waiting, patient, taking its time, knowing that eventually I will come back to those woods, that everyone does in the end. If you are planning to visit Yellowstone, especially the backcountry areas near Lamar Valley, please be careful. Stay on marked trails. Do not hike alone. And if you hear someone calling your name from the forest, someone whose voice sounds familiar, but who should not be there, do not answer. Do not follow. Just turn around and walk away as fast as you can. Some things in this world are not meant to be understood. They are only meant to be survived. I still work for the Park Service, though I requested a transfer to an administrative position last year. Less time in the field, more time behind a desk. It is not the career I imagined when I started, but it keeps me close enough to monitor what is happening without having to be out there myself. I watch the incident reports. I track the missing persons cases. And every time a new name appears on that list, a solo hiker or camper who vanished without explanation in the Grouse Creek area, I add it to my file and I wonder how long this has been going on. How many people have disappeared over the years, over the decades, over the centuries before anyone was keeping records? I wonder if anyone will ever figure out what is really happening in those woods. I wonder if I even want them to. I have been debating whether or not to share this for a while now. It has been about 6 months since everything happened, and I still think about it almost every night before I fall asleep. I just became a park ranger at Yellowstone National Park last summer, and what I experienced during my first week on the job made me question whether this career was really meant for me. Let me give you some background first. I had always wanted to work in the outdoors. Growing up in Montana, I spent most of my childhood hiking trails and camping with my family. When the opportunity came up to work at Yellowstone, I jumped at it without hesitation. I thought it was going to be the dream job. Fresh air, beautiful scenery, peaceful nights under the stars. That was what I imagined anyway. My first few days were pretty standard. Orientation, paperwork, learning the radio codes, and getting familiar with the different sectors of the park. They assigned me to work with a senior ranger named Dale. He was in his late 50s, had been working at the park for over 20 years, and he had that weathered look that comes from spending most of your life outdoors. He did not talk much, but when he did, you could tell he had seen a lot of things out there. On my fourth night, Dale told me we were going to do a patrol near Yellowstone Lake. It was one of the larger bodies of water in the park, and during the summer months, they like to keep an eye on the area because of increased wildlife activity and the occasional camper who wandered too far from the designated zones. We drove out there around 9 in the evening. The sun was just starting to set, and the sky had that deep orange and pink color that you only really see in places like this. I remember thinking how lucky I was to be there. Dale parked the truck near one of the smaller access points on the eastern shore, and we started walking along the edge of the water. For the first hour or so, everything was completely normal. We checked a few campsites, made sure no one was building fires in restricted areas, and documented some animal tracks near the tree line. Dale pointed out a few things to me along the way. He showed me how to identify different types of scat, and he explained the patterns that certain animals follow when they move through the area at night. It was around 11 when things started to feel different. We had stopped near a rocky outcrop that overlooked a quiet section of the lake. The moon was almost full that night, so there was plenty of light reflecting off the water. Dale pulled out a thermos of coffee and poured us each a cup. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, just listening to the sounds of the forest around us. Then Dale said something that stuck with me. He looked out at the water and said, "You ever get the feeling that something is watching you out here?" I laughed a little, thinking he was just trying to mess with the new guy. But when I looked at his face, he was not smiling. He was staring at the far edge of the lake, near where the trees came right up to the water. I followed his gaze and tried to see what he was looking at. At first, I did not notice anything unusual, just trees, water, and the faint outline of the mountains in the distance. But then I saw it. There was something standing at the edge of the water, maybe 200 yards away from us. It was tall, much taller than any person should be, and it was completely still. I asked Dale what it was, but he did not answer right away. He just kept staring at it. After what felt like a full minute, he finally said, "I do not know, but I have seen it before." That was when I started to feel genuinely afraid. Not the kind of fear you get from watching a scary movie, but something deeper, something primal. My hands started to shake, and I could feel my heart beating faster in my chest. The figure at the edge of the lake still had not moved. It was just standing there, facing the water, or maybe it was facing us. It was hard to tell from that distance, but something about the way it stood made me feel like it knew we were watching. Dale slowly put the cap back on the thermos and stood up. He told me, very quietly, that we should head back to the truck. He did not say it in a panicked way, but there was an urgency in his voice that I had never heard from him before. We started walking back along the shoreline, and I made the mistake of looking over my shoulder. The figure was no longer standing where it had been. I scanned the tree line, trying to spot it again, but it was gone. Somehow that was worse than seeing it. We walked faster than we should have. The ground near the lake was uneven, full of roots and loose rocks, and I nearly tripped twice. But neither of us wanted to slow down. Dale kept his flashlight pointed straight ahead, and I noticed he had his hand resting on his radio, though he never actually used it. The silence was the worst part. You would think a forest at night would be full of sounds. Crickets, owls, maybe the wind moving through the trees. But that night, there was nothing. It was like the entire area had gone quiet, like everything else out there knew to be still. I wanted to ask Dale more questions. I wanted to know what he meant when he said he had seen it before. I wanted to know if other rangers had reported anything strange near the lake. But every time I opened my mouth to speak, the words just would not come out. It felt wrong to make noise. It felt like we were being listened to. When we finally reached the truck, I have never been so relieved to see a vehicle in my entire life. Dale unlocked the doors and we both got in quickly. He started the engine and pulled away from the access road without saying a word. I kept my eyes on the side mirror, watching the shoreline disappear behind us. Part of me expected to see that figure standing in the middle of the road, but there was nothing, just darkness and trees. We drove for about 10 minutes before Dale finally spoke. He said, "Look, I am not going to tell you what that was because I genuinely do not know." He kept his eyes on the road the whole time. But I have worked this park for 23 years, and I have seen things out there that I cannot explain. Things that make you wonder if maybe there are parts of this world that we are not supposed to understand. I asked him if he had ever reported any of it. He laughed a little, but it was not a happy kind of laugh. It was tired. He said, "Who would believe me? And even if they did, what are they going to do about it? Send someone out there to investigate? Put up a sign that says, 'Beware of the unknown'?" He had a point. What would anyone even do with that information? When we got back to the ranger station, I went straight to my bunk. I did not sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing at the edge of the water, tall, still, watching. I kept replaying the moment, in my head, trying to convince myself that it was just a tree or a shadow or some kind of optical illusion caused by the moonlight. But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of those things. It moved. It disappeared. And something about its presence felt intentional, like it wanted us to see it. The next morning, I went to look at a map of the park. I found the exact spot where we had been sitting, near the rocky outcrop on the eastern shore. And I noticed something that made my stomach turn. There were old survey notes attached to the map from decades ago. One of them mentioned that the local tribes who lived in the area before the park was established considered that part of the lake to be sacred. They believed it was a place where spirits could pass between worlds. The note said that even the early settlers avoided camping near that shoreline. I showed the notes to Dale later that day. He read them slowly, then handed them back to me without saying anything. But I could see it in his eyes. He was not surprised. I finished out the summer at Yellowstone. I did my job, I learned the trails, and I helped visitors when they needed directions or got lost. But I never went back to that part of the lake, not once, and whenever I was assigned to night patrol, I made sure to request a different sector. Here is the thing that still bothers me, even now 6 months later. I keep thinking about what Dale said, about how there are parts of this world that we are not supposed to understand. I used to think that nature was simple. Beautiful, yes. Dangerous sometimes, sure. But ultimately something that could be explained by science and observation. Now, I'm not so sure. Because whatever was standing at the edge of that lake, it was not an animal. It was not a person. And it was not something that belonged in any guidebook or training manual I have ever read. I do not know if I will ever go back to Yellowstone. Part of me misses it. The mountains, the geysers, the feeling of being surrounded by something ancient and untouched. But another part of me knows that some places hold secrets that are better left alone. And maybe, just maybe, the wilderness does not always want us there. If you ever visit Yellowstone and decide to take a walk near the lake at night, just be careful. Watch the edges of the water. Pay attention to the silence. And if you see something standing where nothing should be standing, do not stare at it for too long, because I think it stares back. I had always wanted to work for the National Park Service. Ever since I was a kid, my dad would take me camping in different national parks across the country, and I fell in love with the wilderness. After college, I bounced around a few different jobs that never felt right. Retail, office work, even tried being a substitute teacher for a semester. Nothing stuck. Then, at 26 years old, I finally got the call I'd been waiting for. I was offered a position as a park ranger at Yellowstone National Park. I remember reading the email 3 times just to make sure it was real. Yellowstone, the oldest national park in the country, the place sitting right on top of one of the largest volcanic systems on Earth. I was going to work there. I packed up my apartment in Colorado and drove out to Wyoming with my car, loaded down with everything I owned. The first few weeks were amazing. Training was intense but rewarding. I learned about wildlife management, visitor safety, emergency, protocols, and all the geological features that made Yellowstone so unique. My supervisors were friendly, and my fellow rangers made me feel welcome. I was stationed at the Old Faithful area initially, which meant I spent most of my time answering tourist questions and making sure nobody got too close to the geysers. But after about 3 weeks, my supervisor, a guy named Marcus, who had been working there for over 15 years, asked if I would be willing to take on a night shift. Apparently, one of the other rangers had to leave unexpectedly due to a family emergency, and they needed someone to cover the backcountry patrol in the Norris Geyser Basin area. I said yes without hesitation. I figured it would be a good opportunity to prove myself, and honestly, I was excited about the idea of being out there alone at night. I thought it would be peaceful. Marcus gave me a briefing that afternoon. He explained the route I would take, the checkpoints I needed to hit, and the radio. Protocols. Standard stuff. But then, right before I left his office, he paused and looked at me with this expression I could not quite read. He said, "If you see anything weird out there, just radio it in and head back to the station. Do not investigate. Do not try to be a hero." I laughed a little and asked him what he meant by weird. He did not laugh back. He just said that the backcountry at night was different than during the day, and that sometimes the thermal features could play tricks on your senses. Steam, gases, shadows moving in strange ways. He told me that new rangers sometimes got spooked their first few times out there alone, and that there was no shame in calling it a night early if I felt uncomfortable. I thanked him for the advice, but honestly, I thought he was just being overly cautious with the new guy. I had camped alone in the wilderness plenty of times. I was not easily scared. That night, I drove out to the trailhead around 9 in the evening. The sun had already set, but there was still a faint glow on the horizon. The air smelled like sulfur, which was normal for that area because of all the geothermal activity. I grabbed my flashlight, my radio, and my pack, and I started walking. For the first hour or so, everything was fine. Beautiful, even. The stars were incredible out there, away from any light pollution. I could see the Milky Way stretching across the sky like a river of light. The only sounds were my footsteps on the trail and the occasional bubbling from nearby hot springs. I checked in at my first 2 waypoints without any issues and radioed back to confirm my position. It was around 11:30 when I noticed something strange. I was walking along a ridge that overlooked one of the smaller thermal pools. The pool itself was giving off a faint steam, glowing slightly from the minerals in the water reflecting the moonlight. I stopped to take it in for a moment, and that is when I realized how quiet everything had become. Not just quiet, silent. No wind, no insects, no distant animal calls. Nothing. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, just listening, and then I heard something that made my stomach drop. Footsteps, coming from somewhere behind me on the trail. Now, let me be clear about something. I was not immediately terrified. My first thought was that it might be another ranger, maybe someone checking up on me since it was my first solo night shift, or possibly a hiker who had stayed out too late and gotten turned around. It happens more often than you would think, even in areas where overnight camping is not permitted. So I turned around and called out. I said something like, "Hello? Someone there?" My voice sounded way too loud in all that silence. It almost felt wrong to speak, like I was breaking some kind of rule I did not know about. No response. Just that thick, heavy quiet pressing in from all sides. I stood there with my flashlight pointed down the trail behind me. The beam cut through. The darkness maybe 40 or 50 feet before it just got swallowed up by the night. I could see the path curving around a cluster of rocks and some dead pines, but nothing was moving. No one was there. I waited for probably a full minute. Then I convinced myself that I had imagined it. Maybe it was an echo of my own footsteps bouncing off the rocks. Maybe it was a small animal moving through the brush. Sound does weird things out there, especially near the thermal areas where the ground is constantly shifting and bubbling. That is what I told myself anyway. I turned back around and kept walking. But here is the thing. I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. You know that sensation you get when someone is watching you? Like this prickling awareness at the back of your neck that makes you want to look over your shoulder, even when you know nothing is there. That is what I felt. And it just kept growing stronger the further I walked. I tried to focus on the job. I checked my map, confirmed I was still on the right path, and radioed in my position at the next waypoint. The dispatcher, a woman named Linda, who I had spoken to a few times before, asked if everything was okay. I said yes. I almost mentioned the footsteps, but I stopped myself. I did not want to seem like the nervous new guy who could not handle being alone in the dark. Around midnight, I reached a section of the trail that ran alongside a long stretch of dormant hot springs. The ground there was pale and crusty, covered in mineral deposits that made it look almost like snow in the moonlight. Steam rose from vents scattered across the landscape, drifting slowly into the air and vanishing. It was beautiful in a haunting kind of way. I was about halfway across this area when I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time, they were not behind me. They were coming from my left, out in the thermal field where no trail existed, where no person should be walking. I stopped immediately and shined my flashlight in that direction. The beam passed over white ground, dark pools of water that reflected nothing, and columns of steam that twisted and curled like living things. I could not see anyone, but I could still hear them. Slow, deliberate steps crunching over the mineral crust. And then they stopped. I did not move. I barely breathed. I just stood there with my flashlight pointed into the steam, waiting for something to appear. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Maybe 10 seconds passed. Maybe 30. I honestly could not tell you. Time felt strange out there, like it was stretching and bending in ways it should not. Then I saw it. At first I thought it was just a thicker patch of steam rising from one of the vents. But it was not moving like steam. It was too solid, too defined. It had a shape to it, and the longer I looked, the more that shape started to look like a person. Tall and thin, just standing there in the middle of the thermal field, maybe 100 feet away from me. I called out again. I asked if someone needed help. I told them that they were in a dangerous area and needed to get back to the trail immediately. No response. The figure did not move at all. It just stood there, facing me. At least I think it was facing me. I could not make out any features. No face, no clothing, nothing distinct. Just this dark silhouette surrounded by drifting steam. I reached for my radio to call it in, and the moment my hand touched the radio on my belt, the figure moved. It did not walk or run. It just shifted, like it flickered from one position to another, and suddenly it was closer, maybe 60 feet away now. I am not ashamed to admit that I started backing up. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, to get out of there as fast as possible. But I also could not look away. I felt like if I took my eyes off it, something terrible would happen. That is when my radio crackled to life and Linda's voice came through asking for a status update. The sound made me jump so badly I almost dropped my flashlight. I fumbled with the radio, pressed the button, and said something like, "I am heading back early. There is something out here. I do not know what it is." Linda asked me to repeat, but her voice was breaking up, full of static. The reception out there was never great, but this was worse than usual. I could barely make out what she was saying. I looked back up at the thermal field. The figure was gone. I did not wait around to see if it would come back. I turned and started walking as fast as I could without breaking into a full sprint. Part of me felt stupid for being so scared. I kept trying to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was just steam playing tricks on me. Maybe there was some weird optical illusion caused by the thermal vents and the darkness. Maybe I was more tired than I realized, and my brain was filling in shapes where there were none. But another part of me, the part that felt ancient and primal and connected to something deeper than logic, knew that was not true. Something had been out there, something that should not have been. I stuck to the trail and moved quickly. My flashlight beam bounced wildly in front of me as I walked, casting strange shadows across the pale ground. Every few seconds, I would glance over my shoulder, expecting to see that dark figure standing in the steam behind me. But the trail remained empty. About 15 minutes later, I reached a small wooden shelter that marked one of the emergency waypoints along the patrol route. It was nothing fancy, just a three-sided structure with a bench and a first aid kit mounted on the wall. But it felt safer than being out in the open, so I ducked inside and tried to catch my breath. My hands were shaking. I noticed that when I tried to use my radio again. The static was still bad, but I managed to get through to Linda. I told her I was cutting the patrol short and heading back to the station. She asked if I needed assistance, if I was injured or in danger. I said no. I just needed to come back. She did not push for more details, which I appreciated. I sat in that shelter for maybe 5 minutes, trying to calm down. The sulfur smell was strong there, and I could hear the distant bubbling of hot springs somewhere nearby. Normal sounds, familiar sounds. I started to feel a little better, and then I heard something that made all of that disappear. It was a voice, faint and distant, coming from somewhere out in the darkness beyond the shelter. I could not make out the words, but it sounded like someone calling, like someone saying a name over and over. I held my breath and listened. The voice kept going, rising and falling in this strange rhythm that did not sound quite right. It was too steady, too mechanical, like a recording being played on a loop. Then I realized something that made my blood run cold. It was my name. Someone or something was calling my name. Out there in the dark, I grabbed my pack and got out of that shelter immediately. I did not care about protocol anymore. I did not care about finishing the patrol or proving myself or any of that. I just wanted to get back to my truck and drive as far away from that place as possible. The walk back to the trailhead took about 40 minutes. It should have taken longer, but I was moving fast, almost jogging at some points. The whole time, I kept hearing things. Footsteps that seemed to pace alongside me in the darkness just beyond the reach of my flashlight. That voice drifting in and out, sometimes closer, sometimes further away. And once, just once, I heard what sounded like laughter. Low and quiet, like someone was standing right behind me and trying not to be heard. I never looked back. I just kept my eyes on the trail and kept moving. When I finally reached the parking area and saw my truck sitting there under the dim glow of the trailhead sign, I almost cried from relief. Unlocked the door, threw my pack in the back, and started the engine. My hands were still trembling on the steering wheel as I pulled out of the lot and drove toward the ranger station. I did not tell anyone the full truth about what happened that night. When Marcus asked me the next morning why I cutted the patrol short, I said the thermal activity was making me feel sick, headache, nausea, that kind of thing. It was a believable excuse, and he did not question it. But I think he knew there was more to it. He gave me this look, the same look he had given me before I left for the shift, like he understood something he was not going to say out loud. I put in my resignation 3 days later, told them I had a family situation back in Colorado that needed my attention. They were understanding about it, which made me feel guilty, but I could not stay there. Every time I looked out at the backcountry, especially at night, I felt this cold dread settling into my chest. I kept having nightmares about that figure in the steam, about that voice calling my name. I drove back to Colorado and tried to move on with my life. Got a different job, tried to forget about Yellowstone. But some nights, when everything is quiet and I am lying in bed, unable to sleep, I still think about it. I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed out there longer. I wonder what that thing was and whether it is still out there, walking through the thermal fields in the dark. I have looked online, tried to find other people who have had similar experiences at Yellowstone. There are stories scattered across forums and comment sections. Rangers and hikers who reported seeing figures that should not have been there. Voices calling from empty trails. Footsteps following them through the backcountry. I do not know what it was. I probably never will. But I know one thing for certain. That first night shift was my last night working there, and I am never going back.